am so excited that in this conversation, Dr. Darin Detwiler, who's been on before, is coming back, joining us for this conversation about special teachers. He has so much to share. Dr. Darin, it's just great to see you. Thank you so much for carving time out of your incredibly busy schedule to come and have this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to see you again.
Oh, it's lovely to see you. And I know that you have so many things that you have written and talked about. You are a multifaceted teacher. I would love for you to share a little bit of your background and how you got to where you are today.
Well, ironically, yesterday I was in a conversation. Someone wants me to work with them on a project, and they said they were drawn to me because of A, my gravitas, and B, because of my agnostic quality in being able to, go between different perspectives and disciplines and platforms. And I think that, quite honestly, I have to start thinking about what are my experiences in the world of teaching, whatever I've been teaching, and essentially what have I left behind, and I want them to be left behind with. It wasn't just you know the conversation of the moment, or it wasn't just an ephemeral topic to discuss or to be assessed. It was something where the perspective, the tools, the understanding that students have can help them have gravitas in terms of that subject, and also to be able to look at it through an agnostic
Mm.
pair of glasses, if you will, to be able to say that it's not just one perspective.
Right. Yes. So you have been in a nuclear submarine. You have been trained at the highest level. You have had conversations with past President Bill Clinton. You have taught in middle school and have been received the state award. I believe it was in Washington for that.
That's correct.
You have taken kids to Washington, D.C., and had amazing stories about that as well. And you also teach internationally now. You've taught online. You have such a deep repertoire of knowledge in terms of being a student and being a teacher. What are some of the pieces that you look back and all that you have done and you go, okay, these are the pieces that have really helped me move the needle forward in education?
I know this is going to sound weird, but if let me give you an example to kind of set the stage for this.
Sure.
Imagine going to the grocery store and getting some ready to eat macaroni and cheese that's clearly like um, pre-made. It's got ridiculous number of ingredients because of shelf stability, that kind of stuff, right? And it's like, yep, okay, that's macaroni and cheese. But then you go to grandma's house, and all of a sudden you're watching her literally in her kitchen teach a master class of how you can make macaroni and cheese with just a handful of ingredients. And it's the best macaroni and cheese that you've ever had.
Ever. Yes.
Right, exactly. And you like, I want to go back to grandma's house
Yes.
because of her macaroni and cheese. That's the way I think about teaching, right? The idea of if you're just teaching whatever it says is the next page or the next chapter in the history book, then you're limited in terms of that pre-packaged, ready to consume
Right.
information consumption, right? Kind of a deal. Um, Whereas, what if it doesn't matter if they're sixth graders, seventh graders, eighth graders, it doesn't matter if they're high school students that are talented and gifted or at risk learners. It doesn't matter if they're undergrad, graduate, doctoral level students. What if you brought in best possible resources, the actual resources, not just a picture of it in a textbook, but today with the internet, we can actually go to the National Archives and look at the actual document. We
Yes.
could actually, and here's a crazy scenario. you know, we definitely know that we can use Zoom in the classroom. And imagine the idea of calling up someone who was a part of an event or who's an expert on an event. Say, hey, would you be willing to talk to my class Tuesday at this time and talk to you live? Here's what my experience has been. When I was a high school student, I'm sorry, what? as a high school teacher. Um, no, literally 20, 25 years ago, uh, I would be teaching subjects, and I know that there's a museum from this location where this place took, where this event took place, and I had a one of those, those telephones with a gazillion buttons on the side. One of them was speakerphone, and I had like a 100-foot cord. I had all the tables pushed together into one big conference table, if you will. I had all the students around the conference table, and I had them kind of we looked at what was the event. We knew about the event. We knew about this museum and why they curated artifacts about the museum. But I had a curator, an expert in this subject. The students kind of they pre-wrote some questions, like it was part of the activity, the day or two before this, and so now they're sitting there, and I hit, you know, whatever speakerphone, and it's like, here's this other person on the other side of the line, and I had students like, wait, is this real? Is this person real? Like, are we really talking to this person? And so
Mhm.
imagine being as teacher standing and you're looking at your students. Now they can't see the guests because this was like 25 years ago or whatever.
Right.
Today would have been a Zoom call, kind of thing. But
Yes.
back then, and you're looking that they can't see the person. Although I did have a picture from their webpage,
Sure.
um, and the guest cannot see the students.
Right.
But my students are like,
Yes.
oh, fixing their collar, fixing their hair or whatever, and it's like
Yes.
all of a sudden it became real. They were part of a real learning environment. There was a real learning experience, and they may not remember the specific pieces of information that were,
Mhm.
were shared there, or even the question that they asked, but I look at it in terms of they would remember, and they talked about this, well long after this. They talked about how they talked to a real person and how it was really cool that their teacher uh, thought that they were important enough and that this topic was important enough for them to hear it from the perspective from someone who's so close to the event, to the source information. I would expand that to have other people. I was talking about an event um, when I was teaching junior high school students, and I literally had lawyers and doctors, epidemiologists, journalists come into the classroom to
Yes.
talk about this experience through their perspective as they were involved in it.
Mhm.
And then one of the journalists shared that I was involved in it as well, and my students had no idea.
Right.
And of course, now all of a sudden, my students went to their laptops and
Yes.
were Googling me. But when you kind of assume that your students are, that this topic and your students are important enough to learn from resources that are beyond what what you have experienced, what you have on hand, that again, the textbook is like that prepackaged example of something that's convenient and shelf stable, but
Yes.
bringing in the experts or looking
Mhm.
at the actual image of it online at the National
Yes.
Archives or the Library of Congress or whatever, that's kind of like going to grandma's house and tasting the way
Yes.
macaronis and cheese should taste.
Yes. Things changed after a while, so we were no longer able to do this. But one of my favorite things about teaching second graders was this particular year was that we got to take a field trip every single month, and we had parents who were driving. I know this is again, this is something, and we also had school buses, so there were different modes of transportation. But in that we got to go to the J. Paul Getty up on the hill to be able to see. And so for some of the kids, they'd never seen the ocean. And, we lived about 30 miles away from the ocean, but that just wasn't part of what their family naturally did. And so to see the ocean from up there and to watch the fog bank come in. So there was that element of it. And this is where we live. But there was also the element of going into a room. And I still love this experience with adults as well, that when you go into a place that has very, very low light because of how ancient the whatever you're looking at is, they don't want to degrade it with light. And so there's that first room that you go into and the voices get quieter, and then you get into the second place and the voices get like to whispering, just because you're in such a cool area. And that year we had been studying all kinds of different Gregorian chant and the art that went along with that, and as we were looking at music through the years. And so we got to actually see illuminated manuscripts that were there, and it was a transformative experience for the students, but also for me, and for the parents who came along. Right, so these opportunities that are available in different ways at different places to be able to pull information and to make it come alive. I know that you are an author of multiple books. Why have you chosen to write, and not only write your own books, but also then be a guest author in other people's publications?
You know, I just don't have enough time. I just don't have enough things to do with all that time that I have.
That's
But
sarcasm.
yeah, yeah, that is sarcasm. In all seriousness, when you realize that there's not a good resource or that something falls short in talking about something, or I wonder if I could, have a resource that takes in consideration the learner perspective, right? The student
Mhm,
perspective, as opposed to this sounds like it's written by a salesman, or this sounds like it's written by this kind of person. So, I wrote a book. My first book was written that encompassed a lot of different interviews. I think there were 78 interviews that I included within that book, and I included elements from my doctoral thesis and my own personal experience, and so many cited resources in that. The second book that I wrote, I had 23 or 24 contributors who wrote chapters, because that's like my perspective alone
mhm,
is not enough. So I would write an introduction to a chapter, and then I would invite two or three people to write about that topic in
mhm,
that chapter from their perspective or from their, like, as it applies to their inside of the industry sector or their commodity. And then I would be basically curating this
mhm,
this collection here, again with the idea of, if my students are reading this, they would be able to see different voices, read different perspectives, things of that nature. But also the time consumption that's required to do that is a little bit much. So contributing to other people's books, writing chapters for those books, especially when it's like, okay, how can I be adding to the existing body of resources out there and making sure that
mhm,
critical elements are explained, and even like, well, there's this, and here's how it lays out together, and here's how you can look at it as a graphic organizer. Here are the resources for these information pieces, and here's how this plays out. So now all of a sudden it becomes a good resource that my students could use. My grad students right now are reading this. In fact, I can actually hold this one up. I did not write this book. This book is American Bar Association book on food law. It's a practical guide, and I worked with the editor to write. Where is it? There, chapter 8, about the legal perspectives, legal considerations when it comes to blockchain, like artificial intelligence and collection and distribution of information, storage and security of information, and how this applies to current regulatory aspects, specifically in the food industry. And for this, I had been attending so many meetings, working with so many stakeholder groups, and basically it's like listening and being a part of these conversations, hearing how it was perceived like this, and then over time it's perceived differently. That was never really being communicated out there in any kind of a credible resource that I could find for my students. It was just kind of like they're taking their instructor's word for it, kind of a deal. So to put that out there and now make it such that it's resource for their student, it again, it is one bit of resource, but I think it's a good piece of resource in this conversation. It also does something else. In a way, it just like my first book right here,
mhm,
having students read a chapter from that, and I was against the idea of making my students buy the book because that seems like a conflict of interest, but
mhm.
it's available for free in the student library at the university, so they can download a PDF of each chapter. Um, it lends a bit of credibility, if you will, in terms of
Yes.
why I think this topic is important,
Mhm,
why I am a notable voice in this specific,
mhm,
you know, topic area. And if you look at the people who I'm quoting, I'm interviewing, I'm having right alongside with me, who collaborated with me on this journey, it's like, okay, well, if they think that my teacher, my instructor is good enough to, work with, there must be something, say something about the quality and the traits of my instructor. So it all kind of comes to a fruition in terms of the idea of whether you're teaching on ground or online, the
Mm,
quality of the experience of the students, you know, it shouldn't be necessarily up to them in terms of what's the easiest thing to do, or maybe even what's the most predictable thing to do, but the idea of what is the best learning resources, the best way of dealing with a topic. And sometimes, people don't see that. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up about the Getty Museum and seeing the view from there. I remember long ago, long ago, taking taking like an art appreciation course.
mhm.
And here's this book, and you're looking at these famous pieces of art. And in a book, you have no sense of size. And sometimes you look at something and you're like, is it this big or is it the size of a wall? And then to go see it in person, to see the actual, and you're like, either, wow, it's way bigger than I thought, or is that it? Kind of a thing. Um, Sometimes even size measurements doesn't mean
Mhm,
they don't mean anything to us. I very fondly recall years ago when I was teaching junior high school U.S. history. I'm the kind of guy who, I mean, I go all out, and I would invite other instructors, other teachers to come watch me teach, and I would invite administrators, and I would even I had to get permission to do this. I would get a substitute,
mhm.
not for me, but for other teachers so that they could have a substitute in their class while they come and watch me teach. And imagine the look on a group of instructors and administrators who came to see me teach when they come into my classroom, my US History 1 classroom with seventh graders, and the chairs are all against the side of the walls, and there's a ton of cardboard and measuring tape and scissors, and the students are making a big, humongous box.
Mm,
And of course, now I have to explain to my visitors what I'm doing. I said, well, look, here's this piece of information that comes from this reputable source that says that families of three or more people who came over on these ships, like the Mayflower, to the
mhm.
New World, were allowed to bring a box that measured this dimension by this dimension by this dimension. And I wanted the students to try to brainstorm why this dimension was purpose. What was the value of this dimension? And I didn't think that the students could effectively do that by just simply giving them the numbers. So I
Right.
wanted them to build the box with cardboard.
Yes.
And once they built that box, and while they were building that box, I'm asking them questions. What can fit in that box?
Mhm.
What would be useful? And students were now saying, oh, you could fit a shovel. Oh, you could fit a shotgun. Oh, this could be like a door. Oh, this could be a table. And then all of a sudden, one of the students goes, oh my God, this could be a coffin, you know and they were saying, a body could fit, and they were coming with all these ideas. So the whole point here is that sometimes, in order to understand historical elements, even something that seems like a throwaway, like the dimensions of a box that families were able to bring over to the New World, think about that. That was their entire life in that box. Everything
Yeah.
they could bring, if it wasn't on their bodies, was in that box. So this was pretty important. So we had a conversation about that, and that led into other conversations. Like, for instance, the famous war novel, the things they carried, about the things that people can carry and what people can carry with them, and conversations about that. So I made it, more relevant to them. The
Mhm.
idea, what are the things that, if they were to move and only had a box like that for their family,
Mhm.
what would they put into it, and things of that nature. And it's like, again, I made it a learning experience that was relevant to them. I made it a learning environment that was putting the tools and resources into it. I know it sounds like a big cry between a chapter in a book for graduate students versus cardboard and making a box in a seventh grade classroom, but the whole idea here is that it's amazing what opportunity and what insights and what brainstorming and just the conversation. Even the students were just talking among themselves,
Mm,
kind of a thing. And that is the kind of learning experience you want to be able to foster in a learning environment. And yeah,
mm,
it takes a little bit of trust and faith, but it also takes the idea of, if you want to manifest what would be the ideal learning situation, sometimes it's messy,
mhm.
sometimes it's noisy, sometimes being in students in seats and rows and columns and being, mouths shut and down and face down in a book does not achieve these specific kind of things. So I want I want others to realize that that could be a great learning
Mm,
environment. And quite honestly, that becomes one of those memories, you
yes.
know not people don't like, "Oh, I remember at 20 minutes into the hour when I was sitting in my chair in the rows and columns, all with my mouth shut and my eyes focused on the book." They don't remember that. They remember they're hands-on, or they're
Mhm.
they're talking with an expert over the phone from the other side of the country,
Right.
or, being able to manipulate the artifact on the website for the National Archives, or being able to physically make a cardboard box kind of a deal.
Mhm. I think one of the pieces that really is so helpful in how you teach is that you are teaching people who are formulating the policy around food in America. So, people who are literally making decisions about what we eat, how things are processed, how clean things are. You are a part of that conversation and have been for quite a while now in this space of helping people to understand that there are things that we the consumer can be doing, but also that there's policy that needs to be in place. And for the people who are making that policy to not just show up and say, this is the only way, and everybody needs to get in line behind me, but to say, we need to have conversation with all of the stakeholders to make sure that this is going to work well for safety, for food safety. And I think that the way that you teach, the way that you have, brought people in, and you're right, it's not about sitting in straight rows all the time and nose in a book. That can be helpful in certain places and times, but the idea of education being really the opportunity to ask questions and to not have the answer for it, and to be able to be in a space of dialogue. I think that that's one of the richest gifts that we can be gifting the next generation of teachers and people who are students who may choose to never be in education, right? They may choose to do something else. Go ahead.
One thing I find is that there are things that I was doing with seventh and eighth graders that I do with my master's degree students and my
Yes.
doctoral candidates. I mean, everything from, I remember learning, if you are watching this and you don't know what I'm talking about, you should Google six hats. There's this way of having students engage in conversation where one hat is about new ideas, one hat is about negative consequences or negative results, one hat
Mhm.
is about positive outcomes, one hat is um, just the facts, kind of a deal. And so you're forcing students to look at information or to put forth ideas through these different hats and to listen to different
Yes.
people.
Yes.
Even in my graduate courses, I have used a version of that, but I also use, let's talk about something, but I'll ask them to, are you are you talking about this in terms of awareness,
Mm.
or being an ally, or
Right.
being an advocate, or being an activist? What if you were wearing one of those four hats, what would each of those four hats, how would they be different in terms of your approach?
Mm.
But even looking at it in terms of my graduate students as being consultants
Mhm.
with industry, we look at corporate social responsibility. So let's take an issue. Let's take this was recently in the news. There's a famous restaurant chain that had these. They have a lemonade. It used to be self-serve, but now you can no longer do it self-serve. But it was called charged lemonade. It had a high amount of caffeine. And people got really sick from this high amount of caffeine in the lemonade. And some people even died because of the impact on the heart.
Yes.
So um, let's let's look at this issue. Let's look at the legality around labeling and around ingredients and communication. But let's look at it in terms of corporate social responsibility, because you have economic responsibilities,
Right.
you have legal responsibilities, you have ethical responsibilities, and you have philanthropic responsibilities. So,
Yes.
how can a leader from a company look at an issue like this and put these different levels into consideration?
Mm.
And as soon as we kind of get some momentum with that, I throw the students another curve. Let's parallel that with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because
Oh,
now consumers and workers are going to be looking at in terms of, the physiological needs, air, water, food, sleep, and then your health and safety and security needs, family needs, self-esteem and self-actualization. How do we do this?
mhm.
How do we align these things with and these concerns with those levels of
Mm.
perspectives, if you will, right? And then I can even bring in how newspaper headlines. I have a couple of examples of where I'll take an event
Mhm.
and I'll look at newspaper or web page, whatever headlines about that event, but they reframe how they talk about it through those different things. One talks about the economics, one talks about the legal situation, one talks about the ethical, like can the leaders be trusted or whatever. And then even the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So we talk about how if in journalism,
Mm.
which is supposed to be the first draft of history, right?
Right.
If they can look at it through these different perspectives, the same exact event, then we should be able to look at a policy, an event, an
Mhm.
incident, whatever it is, through these same different glasses. Too often, students just want to like, can I just find the answer on like page 179?
Right.
Sometimes it's not as easy as
Yes.
the answers right there on page 179.
Right.
Sometimes there's 17 different answers. It really depends on
Yes.
the perspective. But the reality is that the consumers, and
Mhm.
even within consumers, you have young adults, you have older adults, right? You have
Right.
you have uh, educated or uneducated. You have the digital divide. You have those with the ability to access information online and those who don't. You
Right.
have workforce. You may have different language or cultural barriers. And then
Mhm.
you have executives. You have people in the C suite. They're looking at it in terms of this. I've dealt with issues. I'm not kidding. This is a real world example where I was called in by the vice president of a company who's in charge of food safety and quality assurance because at this company, they needed to spend about $2 million to replace their production facility floor because it was well beyond its life, its lifespan. There were so many holes and cracks that they couldn't properly clean it, and they couldn't properly guarantee that it was free from any kind of foodborne pathogens, right?
Right.
But their biggest barrier was the director of financing. The director of financing said, I don't think we should do this, because look at the financial impact. Okay, so it's like in a debate. You need to understand the other
Yes.
side. You need to figure out how to reach and convince the
Mhm.
opposition, if you will, in terms of the fact that, okay, you're looking at numbers in terms of this sense. If
Mhm.
we were to have, replacing the floor could cost
Affordable. Right.
$2 million, but one major outbreak can cost us $12 million, and that's not even
Easily.
the cost of the impact on humans if someone is harmed or
Right.
someone dies, right?
Right.
So sometimes again, it's that need to look at different perspectives and different ways of looking at that we start to realize, go, okay, wow, there are a lot of different positions, and
Mm.
this is why this topic is so important, because there's so many different conflicting perspectives on this, and we've just spent whatever, a couple days, a week or two, whatever, looking at this from these different perspectives, and now I can start to show that I can bring these together to demonstrate more complete understanding of the issue rather than simply a definition, because a definition is this,
Mhm.
but an understanding based on multiple perspectives is huge.
Yeah.
Too many times instructors don't take the time
Mhm.
to do that. Now, again, granted, you can't do that for everything, right?
Right.
There's still only so many hours in a day, so many
Yes.
days in a course, right? So
Yes.
you have to be someone who can say, this right here is so important for me to do this because I can leverage it this way,
Right.
right? And when it came to that idea of the students making that box and understanding
Mhm.
that this was important because when we started to talk about the Western expansion, when we started talking about the states, we started talking about the movement of people, we started talking about immigration, we started talking about these things. In order to understand some of the complications of these issues, I wanted to be able to go back to the idea of understanding taking stuff with you and how before these different industrial revolutions, you only
Right.
had these things. And, especially in a very throwaway society that we are today,
Yes.
um, to talk to a group of younger students and say, yeah, we're going to reuse this wood from this box to become our table because we can't just go to IKEA and buy
Right.
a table and put it together. And then when we're done with it,
Yes.
throw it away on the curb and have the trash truck come pick it up and get a new one.
Right.
Kind of, you had to really, you had to really kind of put this into that construct there.
Henry Ford was somebody who said, okay, when you guys ship me this stuff, it needs to be in boxes that are this size. They would take the boxes apart. He would reuse that wood in the seats. I mean, how brilliant is that, right? Just to be able to say, this is going to be multi purposed. And I know that I need to have this wood. It needs to be this size. So when you guys ship me the things that you're going to ship, these are my requirements. And I think that that's also part of coming back to that conversation about, $2 million for a floor versus $12 million for what could be happening. And for me, it becomes an eventuality, right? At some point, if you don't fix the floor, there will be an issue. It doesn't matter how much bleach you're putting on it at night. It doesn't matter. There will be some type of a reaction to the fact that the floor, whether somebody trips on it, whatever it's going to be, right? And
Yeah.
so the idea of being able to speak, and I think that's one of the places where when my daughter was taking speech and debate, that she had to be able to write from every perspective was so incredibly helpful for her. Now that she has her doctorate and she's working in a company, she is not necessarily forward facing all the time, but she can easily, she'll be presenting really soon in person in San Diego because she understands their perspective and what they are looking for. And as she's creating that on the backside, it's not necessarily to the point that she's ready to share with the whole world what she's working on, but yet for this particular client, this is what they're looking for, what they want. So she's going to be able to go and share that with her. I believe that part of her ability to do that and do that well is because of speech and debate. The ability to go and do the research and to really sit with, even though if you're personally uncomfortable with that particular perspective, to be able to sit with it in order to find the language to be able to convince somebody else that this really is the right place and the right thing to do.
Well, I'm glad you were talking about the research element because I'm fortunate enough to have been able to earn my bachelor's degree at a time where there were no computers, or at least computers were a very small percentage of
Right.
the learning environment. And so I decided to take a thesis course my
Mm.
senior year of my bachelor's degree. This was after I was in the military. I'm a father, I'm a husband at this point. And I was looking at in the 1968 USS Pueblo incident, where a US ship was captured by the North Koreans. And it was very polarizing and of a topic. So my thesis was that there was this impact and changing perspective over time,
Mhm.
and I decided to engage in quantitative analysis of historical
Mm.
information by going into the depths of the library, into the microfiche and all the archives.
Right.
And I found every single magazine, like Time magazine, Life magazine.
Mhm.
There's all these other magazines we don't even have today.
Right.
but and what I did was, um, you know, every single issue during this period and the 6 months after the
Mhm.
release of the crew. And it was like I gave like, if it was on the cover, there was indication. If it was a feature article, there was indication. If it was a letter to the editor, there was indication. If it was an editorial, there was an indication. If it was a whatever it is, basically classified these different things, and I collected what were the key words, that kind of stuff, and I was able to show over time that there was a change in attitude over this.
Yes.
And I remember presenting it, and my professor at the time was like, "Wait, so you're basic." you were using mathematical analysis to be able to justify your conclusion. You did this by this, and it was a very novel way. Years later, I was trying to explain this, and there were people that were like, wait a minute, you used math in a history course? I'm like, yes, because how else would I be able to better understand this?
Right.
So going to that whole idea of the creating the box, the students creating the
Mhm.
box in my history class, anytime we were able to use math and science,
Yeah.
um, I
Bring
look
that
at it in terms of the fact that you have people that are more visual or more
Mhm.
auditory or more hands-on. I had students that were much more like they were excited when we got to use a calculator. They were excited. Um, the cotton gin,
Mhm.
right? Well, I had my students. I went and bought an actual cotton boll. An
Mhm.
unprocessed fluff of cotton that you had to
Yes.
pick the leaves and the seeds out of it, and I
Yeah.
had my students weigh it, and then I had them take it home, and they would pick
Mhm.
all the little things out of it, and then they would weigh it again, and they would record how much time it took them to get them from this to this. And then I had students bring in like an extra large, large, medium, small, whatever cotton, 100% cotton t-shirt. We weighed those.
Yes.
So we had to determine how many of these. Of course, I said there had to be, an assumption for 10% loss.
Right.
So we just made up a number, right? But it's better than not. And so how many of these would it take to make, a shirt kind of a deal?
Mhm.
Because without that, you don't really have a context. You have no concept of what it is. So to understand why is there this piece of art where it's depicting slaves in American history? They were jumping for joy and dancing around a cotton gin. That seems like it's propaganda. That seems like it's not real. Why on earth would slaves be jumping and happy about the cotton gin? Perhaps because of the time-saving labor aspect of it. That was what I was hoping. It's one thing if I tell them that.
Right.
Another thing, if the students go, well, maybe they're happy because it took me a long time to do this, and if I was to do this to make an
Yes.
outfit, it would take me forever. Um,
Mhm.
and we read journals where it said that they were, up past dark working, by candlelight
Yes.
because there was still
Yes.
a requirement to fill a basket every night, kind of a thing. And
Mhm.
again, totally out of context in these, contemporary students' lives, the
Yeah.
idea of all these things. So, doing, and you know what? It cost, I think it was like 31 cents, maybe
Mhm.
even less. It really did not cost a lot of money to
Yeah.
buy those cotton bowls, to put them into the hands of the students and to have them do that.
Yes.
But the value, the
Mhm.
value was priceless because now they had a sense of, okay, this is what it was like.
Mhm.
I'm not watching a video. I'm not reading an article. I'm actually in my hand. I'm tactile. I'm doing this, um, and they're able to do that. And it's from their experience now that they ask the questions. Now, mind you, this could take 3 or 4 days, right?
Right.
I could have just bypassed the whole thing and just said, "Here's this picture. They're happy because of this. Moving on. Let's talk
Right.
about this topic now." It would have been lost on them.
Mhm.
So again, why was that important? I needed to leverage the role of technology in the Industrial Revolution and how everything from you know guns, germs, and steel, and as a book talking about how inventions were radically important to the history of understanding the Civil War and the
Mm.
Industrial Revolution
Yes.
and the
Yes.
movement of people from the farms to the cities, at
Mhm.
the turn of the century, and it's hard to convey that to students who are in seventh grade, eighth grade today, who again, everything's ephemeral, everything's immediate now, everything is so developed and advanced, and why would anyone live there, and why would anyone do that? Well, let's put some experience. We
Mhm.
even did things with the telegraph. I would have them
Mm.
basically understand the telegraph to understand how did the telegraph impact our modern form of journalism,
Mm.
because it would take them a while to decipher the dots and the dashes and send messages and things like that. And they would
Yes.
realize that if you're wasting time talking about the weather, but you forgot about the fact that, our side won the war or something like that, whatever it is, a critical piece of information. So, yeah, whenever you have the ability to give students the opportunity
Mhm.
it's one thing to say, well, there's a lot of play involved. It's another thing to say, I can justify it because this is going to help students understand this bigger concept, and that going forward, I can go back to, we'll be talking about something else.
Yes.
Like, for instance, talking about the steamship or talking about,
Right.
nuclear power,
Mhm.
as a form of energy or whatever, and saying, go back to when we were talking about the telegraph. Go back to when we were talking about the cotton gin. Go back to when we were talking about this piece of technology, and let's
Yeah.
think about how transformative that was for those people at that time. But also think about that eye-opening experience you had, and think about that in terms of this.
Yes.
It's those anchoring moments where you can really build
Mhm.
upon it, allow students to um, move from being aware of it to now all of a sudden
Mm.
being an ally, understanding why someone's position was on this, and maybe being an advocate for why it's important to know this to understand that.
Yeah. Dr. Darin, I really appreciate what you're talking about, these anchoring things. I know that for me, teaching younger children, that the first day of school, I wanted them to know the lay of the land, literally. This is where we go when we play. This is where the restrooms are. This is where lunch is. This is when we have a fire drill, this is where we come out to it. When we have an earthquake drill, this is how we're going to do it. And putting other fun little pieces and different things in there as well. But that first day really was here's the lay of the land, those anchoring things, because for us, safety was first, is first in the classroom. And after everybody feels safe, then you can begin to have these conversations about other kinds of things. The mind begins to open up to possibility and opportunity. But if somebody isn't feeling safe, if they don't have those anchoring pieces, they aren't going to be able to move forward or be as willing to open up to different ideas and different concepts. What would be your advice to somebody who is considering coming into education? You came in from a different field and chose this. Maybe it wasn't necessarily where you were going to go without some dramatic life things happening, but this has really been a place that you have found, I believe, um, the opportunity to make the most impact on the future generations has been through you becoming a teacher and you educating. So, what would you say to other people who are considering coming from a different background and realize that education really does give the opportunity to change minds and to change the future? What advice would you give them?
I would say three things.
Mm.
One is, don't be a teacher, be a role model. Be someone who, maybe the lesson that the students learned is not about 2 plus 2 as much as it is also about how everyone has a voice, everyone's voice is respected, everyone should have trust and confidence and should respect their classmates, even if they got a wrong answer, the understanding that it's part of the process, or even if they approach an answer with a different methodology, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong because yours is different, that everyone is in this learning environment and has a future. And unfortunately, we see too many examples of where it's just easier to ignore a student or to ignore an issue in the classroom or to dismiss it, but to address it hands on. And quite honestly, that works if you're in a third grade class, or quite honestly, if you're also even teaching an online course and you have students in the discussion boards, especially who have different opinions, and in this politically charged world where it's like, okay, let's not focus on the political framework that they look at it at. Let's look at the context here. I think
Right.
number two
Mm.
is, your classroom may be its own little silo, but your profession does not have to be in a silo. Look at other teachers, visit their classrooms, use, if you've got like second period prep every once in a while. One of the things I remember fondly from my high school, middle school years was that one day a week during my prep period, I would always go and I went on a walkabout. And I even brought other teachers with me. We'd go on a walkabout. And some of my favorite walkabout experiences were like going to the music class or going to the wood shop or going to the cooking class or going to the math class or whatever. Seeing my students, like here's you got this this straight A student who's all about the grades and stuff, and to find out that she just loves the wood shop, and you're like, hey, why? I'm really surprised to see you this excited in the wood shop. It's kind of against character. She's like, oh no, I love being able to take the saw and cut wood and hammer nails in it and build something, and be able to have this very tangible thing that I made. And or in the music class, to see your students now working, they can't work together in a group project in your history class, but they can play music together, right? How can you open your eyes to seeing your students in a different way, and how can you bring that example? If they can work together as musicians in this class, how can they then work together in your class? Maybe it's the analogy or the story or the way you bring up that kind of a situation there. So the value of breaking out of your silo for your career
Mhm.
can
Definitely.
be very powerful. I think the last thing that I would add is the idea that, um, never forget that you don't necessarily know their perspective on things.
Mm.
Um, I've had students who were paralyzed from the neck down, who were born without arms. I've had students who their contribution to the class was not necessarily what one could predict.
Mhm.
I have students who 10, 15, 20 years later, they're connected with me on Facebook all these years later, and they'll say things like, I'll never forget the lesson you taught us about making sure that the student who's paralyzed from the neck down had a place within the class. And it's like that made science learning important to me, because you didn't just treat them like every other student. You taught them like they had a role and that they offered something to the class. And you asked us to help them with this. This is a student who, um, the other students worked. They basically made like this framework that attached to his wheelchair that would hold a camera, and we found that he can move his thumb, and I purchased a camera, a digital camera that had a remote, so that he could take photos like crime scene photography in the class of the students lab setup kind of stuff. And it
Yes.
was like, yeah, okay, was
Yes.
that the most important thing, in the bigger picture of what a science class looks like? No, but it was important to that student, and it was important what I demonstrated to the other students in
Yes.
terms of,
Value.
that lifelong value. And
Yes.
I could probably come up with a bunch of other, but I'll start to cry because some
Yes.
of these things I didn't realize until later, when
Mhm.
students had the maturity to be able to communicate
Mhm.
what experience they had in my classroom years ago that
Right.
sticks with them today.
Yes.
And that was the big life lesson, or
Mhm.
that was them in an environment at a time where maybe their home life sucked, or the world around them
Right.
sounded depressing on the news, but they found
Yes.
safety and security and purpose and belong in my classroom.
Yes.
And if you allow your classroom and your teaching to
Mhm.
create that kind of a scenario, when
Yes.
we say things like lifelong learners or people engaged or people that go on to lead productive lives or whatever,
Mhm.
this is how it happens. And um, it's sad that there's a lot of controversy around teachers and how teachers are respected, how they're paid, how they're
Mhm.
managed today. And I think that one of the things that's hard for a policymaker or an economist to enumerate is that lifelong impact that a good teacher can have on their
Yes.
students. And I hope that anyone who goes into teaching doesn't do it for a paycheck,
Right.
but does it for the dividends and the payoff and the true value that
Mhm.
blossoms over time, even well beyond their years in the classroom. I
Yes.
still hear I still hear little stories from past students on social media, um, and I've even had seventh graders that I taught when I left teaching public schools and I went to the university. imagine the scenario where you're contacted by a student who just applied to your university, and he goes, "Hey, you might not remember me, but years ago, you were my teacher when I was in seventh grade.
Amazing.
But I was teaching near Seattle, and now I'm in Boston.
Exactly.
Here's students that went across the country to a university and
It's,
found that I'm teaching there, and they wanted to get me up to speed with where they're at, and they were so proud of that. And
mm,
but the one student saying that, remember how you told us the difference between saying I'm done versus I completed the job, and you gave us this
yes,
worksheet to take notes in seventh grade
yes,
US history class? I
right,
still use it. I
yes,
still use it. I'm taking classes in my university courses, and I still take your note taking
yes,
example and model, and your philosophy between knowing enough to know when you're truly complete as opposed to I'm done. And
yes,
it's like, that's cool, it's
yes.
it really it makes me reflect back on my role in the classroom,
Mhm,
as again being much more than what just took place in that silo, and being much more than just
yes.
my perspective, and being much more than just whatever the textbook had in front of me.
Mm, mm. Well, as we wrap up our time together, Dr. Darin, I would love for you to reiterate or to share one final thought on being a teacher, on the impact of teaching, on books that you've written, on food safety, on any of the things, on nuclear power, on any of the things that are touching your heart right now.
This may seem very odd, but based on what you just said, there's a band director out there who was my of all the things, he was my teacher, like, when I was in elementary school, and then he was the teacher when I was in junior high school, and
Yeah.
then he took over for the high school teacher when I was in high school, so I had him for multiple years, and in a marching band, concert
Mhm.
band, choir, all that kind of stuff, the larger, band scenario for many years.
Mm.
Some of the lessons were not about playing the music or playing the instrument,
Yeah.
but about playing with a group, and about listening, and about cooperating, about doing so many things. And the point I want to make is that those lessons carried me. I mean, not just those lessons, but I thought about some of those lessons when I was in the Navy. I thought about some of those lessons as a father. I thought of some of those
Yes.
lessons as a teacher. I think of some of those lessons uh, as a professor, and as someone who works with industry now.
Yeah.
And I don't think that he wrote it down as this is the lesson that I'm going to teach,
Yeah.
but perhaps he um, prioritized the
Mm.
lesson that his students would learn. And when those lessons truly resonate with a student, they
Mhm.
can be not only something that creates lifelong learners, but it can be something that people think about and resonate throughout their
Mm.
various stages of their life. And I always think about Mr. Urick back in those years in terms of those things that were not written in a lesson plan, but were definitely some of those lessons that I learned.
And those things that are now written on your heart. That's just so profound. Dr. Darin Detwiler, thank you again for your incredible gift of sharing time and your expertise and knowledge. And I just so appreciate you being on Simply Sarah, coming back again. And I find these conversations just so delightful.
Well, thank you very much.
And so next time when we are together, we'll have another conversation with another person who's an industry thought leader, somebody who's making a difference. But in this space and time, I invite you to be the difference that you want to see in the world. It sounds a little cliche, but I think it's so appropriate for following this conversation with Dr. Darin. We'll see you next time.